Cade had exactly $53 in his pocket when he stepped out of the Missouri State Foster Center for the last time. Not 54, not 52, 53. He had counted it twice that morning sitting on the edge of a bed that was never really his in a room that was never really home. Three crumpled 20s, a 10, and three ones. Everything he owned in the world fit inside a backpack that smelled like industrial laundry detergent and someone else's life. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. No slam, no drama. Just a quiet, mechanical sound that said in the simplest possible terms, "You are no longer our problem." The parking lot stretched out in front of him, wet and empty under a pale winter sky. A cold wind swept across the asphalt, the kind of dry Missouri wind that doesn't howl or scream, but just cuts. Slides right through a cheap jacket like it isn't even there. Finds the skin underneath and stays. No one came to see him off. No social worker with a clipboard full of encouraging words. No former foster parent pretending to care for 5 more minutes. No friend waiting by a car with the engine running. Just Cade the wind and the long road that started right at his feet and didn't seem to end anywhere in particular. He was 18 years old, legally an adult, practically a ghost. He started walking. The bus took him south for a while, then west, cutting through small towns with names he forgot as soon as they passed. The landscape outside the window shifted from suburban gray to something more open, more honest. Fields, tree lines, the occasional farmhouse, sitting alone in the middle of nothing. He watched it all with the blank expression of someone who had learned early that paying too much attention to a place only made it harder when you had to leave. By late afternoon, the bus dropped him near a stretch of Highway 54 that didn't seem important enough to have a name. A gas station, a gravel lot, and across the road, a roadside diner with a flickering neon sign that read half of whatever it was supposed to say. Cade crossed the highway and pushed through the diner door. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of old grease and burned coffee. The kind of place where the menus hadn't changed since the 90s and nobody expected them to. Cracked vinyl booths. A counter with stools that wobbled. A ceiling fan that turned so slowly it seemed like it was thinking about stopping. A few truckers sat near the window, hunched over plates of something brown and steaming. An older couple shared a booth without speaking, the way people do when they've been together so long that silence is just another kind of conversation. A waitress with tired eyes and a pen behind her ear moved between tables like she was running on muscle memory alone. Cade slid into a booth near the heater. The vinyl was torn, patched with duct tape that had started peeling at the edges. He set his backpack on the seat beside him and picked up the menu. His eyes went straight to the bottom. Cheapest thing, a cup of soup and a bread roll, $2.75. He ordered it without looking up. When the soup came, he wrapped both hands around the bowl and just held it. Let the heat soak into his fingers, up through his palms, into the parts of him that the wind had gotten to. The bread was stale, but he didn't care. He tore it into pieces and dropped them into the broth, watching them sink and soften. Then he ate slowly, not because he was savoring it, but because he didn't know when the next meal would come. An old television mounted in the corner of the diner crackled with static. The screen flickered, went blue, then settled on a local broadcast. Some kind of county auction. Foreclosed properties. The volume was low, but the closed captions scrolled across the bottom in blocky, white letters, slightly out of sync with the auctioneer's mouth. Most people in the diner ignored it. One of the truckers glanced up, then went back to his phone. The older couple didn't even turn their heads. But Cade watched. The properties scrolled by, one after another. A water-damaged duplex in Jefferson City, a storage unit lot near Sedalia, an overgrown parcel outside of Lebanon with no structure on it at all. Numbers floated across the screen. Starting bids, most of them in the thousands, some higher. None of them meant anything to a kid with $53. Then the image changed. A cabin appeared on screen. Small, broken, buried deep in the Ozark Hills. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, probably by a county assessor who didn't feel like getting any closer. Peeling wood siding, a roof that sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. Windows shattered, some of them boarded, most of them not. The porch leaned hard to one side, half its railing missing. Behind the cabin, thick forest pressed in from every direction, dark and tangled, like the land was trying to swallow the structure whole. The caption at the bottom read, Lot 7 Unincorporated, Miller County, cabin and surrounding acreage. Abandoned. Starting bid $10. $10. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the diner's small speaker, tinny and distant. $10 opening bid. Anyone for 10. $10 for the property cabin included. Do I hear 10? A trucker near the counter laughed without looking up. The waitress shook her head slightly and refilled someone's coffee. $10? Last call on lot 7. Someone at the counter muttered just loud enough for Cade to hear. You'd have to pay me to take that dump. Laughter, scattered and tired. The kind of laugh people give when something is so far beneath them, it's not even worth real attention. But Cade didn't laugh. He leaned forward in the booth. His fingers tightened around the ceramic mug. Something about the image on the screen held him. Not the cabin itself. That was clearly a wreck. But the forest around it, the isolation, the sheer distance between that place and everything else. No neighbors, no roads, no system, no clipboard, no signature. No one deciding whether you were worth keeping. Just land. Broken, forgotten land. And for $10 it could be his. Then he noticed something else. Something the grainy footage almost hid. Near the front porch in the mud, there were tire tracks. Fresh ones. Deep grooves pressed into the earth by something heavier than a county assessor's sedan. The kind of tracks made by trucks. Recent trucks. That didn't match the words scrolling underneath the image. Abandoned. The auctioneer's voice came through one last time. Last call on lot 7. Going once. Cade's heart was beating faster than it should have been. His hand moved before his brain fully agreed. He pulled out his phone. The old one. Cracked screen, prepaid minutes, barely enough signal to send a text. But the auction website was listed on the screen. He typed it in. The page loaded slowly, buffering, struggling against the weak signal. Going twice, the bid button appeared. $10. He stared at it. Every rational thought he had told him to stop. You have $53. That's all you have. You don't know where that cabin is. You don't have a car. You don't have a plane. You're 18 years old and alone in a diner in the middle of Missouri. And you're about to spend a fifth of everything you own on a pile of rotting wood in the middle of nowhere. He pressed the button. Sold. Lot 7, $10. The screen refreshed. A confirmation message appeared in plain text. Congratulations. Please visit the Miller County Recorder's office to complete your transaction. Cade sat back in the booth. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold this time. He had just bought a house. The Miller County Recorder's office was a small brick building on the edge of a town that barely qualified as one. Cade found it the next morning after spending the night on a bench at the bus station, his backpack as a pillow, his jacket zipped to the throat. Inside, the office smelled like old paper and carpet glue. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A woman sat behind the counter, mid-60s, maybe with reading glasses, hanging low on her nose, and a cardigan that looked like it had seen more winters than Cade had been alive. A nameplate on the desk read Marlene Dufresne, County Clerk. Cade approached the counter and slid the printed confirmation across the surface. I'm here to pick up a deed, he said. Marlene looked at the paper, then at him, then back at the paper. Lot 7, she said flatly. Yes, ma'am. She didn't move right away, just studied him over the rim of her glasses with an expression Cade couldn't quite read. Not pity, not surprise. Something closer to recognition, like she had seen this before and already knew how it ended. She turned to a filing cabinet behind her, pulled a folder, and began processing the paperwork in silence. The only sound was the scratch of her pen and the occasional click of her keyboard. Cade signed where she pointed, printed his name where she told him to, showed his ID, the one the foster system had helped him get 2 months before his birthday, and waited. When the deed was ready, Marlene slid it across the counter. But she didn't let go right away. Her fingers rested on the edge of the paper, holding it there. Kid, she said quietly. Cade met her eyes. Nobody buys that place. He frowned. Why not? She paused. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, then steadied. Because the last few owners didn't stick around long enough to sell it. The words sat between them for a moment. Cade waited for more an explanation, a story, something concrete. But Marlene just released the deed and leaned back in her chair. The property's about 15 miles from Briar Creek Station, she said, her tone shifting back to business. No bus goes out that far. You'll be walking. Cade folded the deed and put it in his jacket pocket. I'm used to walking. He was almost to the door when her voice stopped him. Cade? He turned. Marlene opened a desk drawer and took out a small card. Plain white. A phone number written in blue ink. No name. She held it out. If something doesn't feel right out there, she said carefully, you call this number. Cade took the card, looked at it, looked at her. Whose number is it? Someone who knows that land better than anyone in this county. She didn't say anything else. Cade slipped the card into his pocket next to the deed and walked out into the cold morning air. The bus dropped him at a cracked gas station about 15 miles from the coordinates printed on his deed. A two-pump station with a faded awning and a handwritten sign that said cash only. An old dog slept near the door unbothered by anything. From there it was boots on gravel, then dirt, then barely a trail at all. The Ozark Hills rose around him slowly, like the land was lifting itself up to get a better look at whoever was foolish enough to walk this far in. The trees thickened with every mile. Oak and hickory and cedar, their bare winter branches lacing together overhead like the bones of something ancient. The air smelled like cold earth and dead leaves and the faint sweetness of rot. Cade walked for 3 hours. His legs ached. His pack dug into his shoulders. The bread from the diner was long gone and his stomach had stopped growling and settled into a dull, low throb that he tried to ignore. By the time he reached the property, the sun was already dipping behind the western ridge, throwing long orange shadows through the trees. The light came in at a low angle, turning everything golden for a few minutes before the color bled out and the gray crept in. And then he saw it. The cabin. It was worse than the television had shown. Much worse. The roof didn't just sag, it caved. The middle section had collapsed inward, pulling shingles and tar paper down into what had probably once been a living room. One entire wall leaned outward at an angle that defied whatever was left of the foundation. The porch, or what remained of it, tilted so sharply to the left that stepping onto it felt like boarding a sinking ship. Windows were shattered, jagged glass clung to the frames like broken teeth. The front door hung open on one hinge, swaying slightly in the wind, creaking in a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate, almost like breathing. Cade stood at the edge of the clearing and stared. $10, he said aloud. His voice sounded strange out here, too small for the silence around it. Yeah, that makes sense. He crossed the clearing, slowly scanning the ground as he went. And there they were, the tire tracks he had noticed on the television. Deeper than he expected, wide tread, heavy vehicle. They led from somewhere behind the tree line, curved past the cabin's east side, and disappeared again into the woods. The mud around them was still soft. These weren't old tracks, a week, maybe less. Someone had been here recently, someone with a truck, at a cabin that the county said had been abandoned for years. Cade filed that away and kept moving. He pushed the front door open. It groaned loud and long, the sound rolling through the empty structure like a warning. Inside, the air hit him immediately. Damp, heavy, mold and wet wood, and underneath it something faintly metallic, like old pennies, like blood that had dried a long time ago. The floor creaked with every step. Some boards felt soft, ready to give way. Others held but complained about it. The walls were bare, stripped of anything that might have once made this a home. No furniture, no curtains, no pictures, just gray wood and shadow, and the slow, steady sound of the wind finding its way through every crack and gap. But then Cade noticed something. In the kitchen near the back wall, a section of the floor looked different. Not new, but not as destroyed as everything around it. The wood was cleaner, less warped. The dust was thinner, almost like someone had swept it recently. And the nails holding the boards down were different from the rest. Newer, shinier, set flush into the wood with a precision that didn't match the decay everywhere else. Cade crouched down, ran his fingers along the seam between the old floor and the newer section. The texture changed. The temperature changed. Underneath it felt colder, harder, like there was something solid beneath the wood. Something that wasn't dirt. That's weird, he whispered. His stomach growled again, louder this time, almost angry. He hadn't eaten since the diner. He searched the rest of the cabin, opened every cabinet, checked every corner. Nothing. No food, no water, just scraps and rust and the skeleton of a place that had given up a long time ago. Outside, the temperature dropped fast. The Ozarks didn't ease into night. They fell into it. One moment the sky was gray, The next it was black. No street lights, no porch lights, no glow from a neighboring house, just darkness so complete it felt like a physical thing pressing against the cabin walls, filling every broken window. Cade sat in the corner of what had once been the living room, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around himself. He could see his breath in the air, thin white clouds that appeared and dissolved and appeared again. The cold came from everywhere, through the walls, through the floor, through the gaps in the roof where he could see a handful of stars if he tilted his head just right. He thought about building a fire, but there was nothing dry enough to burn and nowhere safe enough to burn it. The cabin felt like it might go up with a single spark. So he sat, and he shivered, and he listened. The forest at night was not quiet. It was full of sounds, but none of them were comforting. Branches creaking under their own weight, small animals moving through dead leaves, the distant call of something he couldn't identify. An owl maybe, maybe something else. The wind shifted directions every few minutes, and each time it did, the cabin responded. A groan from the roof, a rattle from a window frame, a whisper from somewhere in the walls that sounded almost human, and then, clink, Cade froze. A faint metallic sound, soft but unmistakable, coming from somewhere beneath him, clink, clink, like metal tapping against metal, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Cade slowly lifted his head and looked at the floor. The section of cleaner wood in the kitchen was maybe 15 feet from where he sat. In the darkness, he couldn't see it, but he knew exactly where it was. Probably just pipes, he whispered. But he hadn't seen any plumbing, no faucets, no water heater. Nothing in this cabin suggested running water had existed here in decades. The sound stopped. Silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Cade held his breath without meaning to, counting seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then from outside a different sound, a soft crunch, footsteps on dry leaves. Not an animal. The rhythm was wrong. Too steady, too even. 2 feet, not 4. Cade turned toward the broken window. The darkness outside was absolute. He couldn't see the tree line, couldn't see the clearing, couldn't see anything beyond the jagged edges of glass still clinging to the frame. But then up on the ridge, far away but unmistakable, a light. Small, flickering, orange like a flame. It appeared for maybe 3 seconds, steady and deliberate, and then it was gone. Cade stared into the blackness. His heart had picked up, beating harder than the cold should have allowed. "Okay," he said under his breath. "Not alone." He didn't sleep that night, not really. He drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite rest, his body too cold and too alert to fully shut down. Every sound pulled him back, every shift in the wind reset the clock. And beneath it all, curling around the edges of every thought, was the same quiet understanding he had carried with him out of the foster center, out of the diner, out of the county office, and into these woods. Something wasn't right here. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was being used. And whoever was using it knew the cabin was supposed to be empty. Cade lasted until morning before the cold and hunger pushed him into action. The first light crept through the broken windows in pale gray streaks, illuminating dust that hung in the air like it had nowhere else to go. The cabin looked worse in daylight. The walls seemed thinner. The floor seemed softer. Everything felt temporary, like the whole structure was held together by habit and nothing more. But that patch of flooring in the kitchen, still cleaner, still newer, still wrong. It pulled at him like a magnet. "All right," he muttered, rubbing his hands together to get the blood moving. "Let's see what you're hiding." He went outside first. The morning air was sharp and still. Frost covered the ground in a thin white sheet that crunched under his boots. Near the porch, half buried under a pile of wet leaves and splintered wood, he found a crowbar. Old, rusted, but solid enough. Back inside, he crouched over the kitchen floor and worked the flat end of the crowbar under the first board. It resisted. He leaned into it, shifting his weight. The nails groaned, the wood flexed. Then with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, the first plank came free. Cade's breath caught. Underneath the wood, there was no dirt, no crawl space, no rotting subfloor. There was steel. A flat metal surface, industrial gray, smooth and cold to the touch. A hatch, recessed handle, flush-mounted hinges. The kind of hardware that didn't belong in a falling-apart cabin in the middle of the Ozarks. the kind of hardware that belonged in a military installation. He pulled more boards. Each one came faster, and now his arms fueled by adrenaline more than strength. Within minutes, the full outline of the hatch was visible, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, perfectly square, perfectly sealed. Cade sat back on his heels and stared at it. "Okay," he said to the empty room. "That's not normal." He hooked the crowbar under the recessed handle and pulled. The hatch was heavy, heavier than it looked. It resisted, then gave way with a low groan, releasing a rush of cold, stale air that hit him full in the face. It smelled like concrete and machine oil and something else, something sharp and chemical. Darkness below, a square opening leading down into nothing. He grabbed the flashlight from his pack. The old one. Batteries nearly dead. The beam flickered and stuttered, throwing weak circles of light that barely reached the bottom. But they reached far enough. Stairs, concrete steps clean and even, leading down about 12 feet into a room that was larger than the cabin above it. Cade swallowed hard. Then he went down. Each step echoed in the confined space, bouncing off walls he couldn't yet see. The air grew colder with every foot, but it was a different kind of cold. Controlled. Dry. Not the damp chill of the cabin above. He reached the bottom and swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The beam hit shelves first. Metal shelving units, floor to ceiling, bolted to concrete walls. On them, rows of military-style rations sealed in olive drab packaging. Water containers, 5-gallon jugs stacked 3 deep. Medical kits in hard plastic cases with Red Cross markings. A portable generator, compact and modern, with a full fuel can beside it. Tools. Wrenches, pliers, wire cutters, all organized on a pegboard with the kind of precision that suggested routine use. Then the beam moved further. Weapons. Rifles, at least a dozen standing upright in a wooden rack along the far wall. Ammunition boxes stacked beneath them, each one labeled in stenciled black letters. Tactical vests hung on hooks. Night vision goggles in foam-lined cases. 2 handguns on a separate shelf, each with a spare magazine. Cade's flashlight trembled in his hand. What the hell? In the far corner, a folding table held a stack of papers and a radio unit. The radio was on. A faint static hiss pulsed from its speaker, low and constant like a heartbeat. Next to it, pinned to the table with a knife, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding forest. Routes were marked in red ink. Circles highlighted specific locations. Symbols he didn't recognize were scattered across the terrain lines, small triangles, X's, numbers without context. This wasn't someone's survival stash. This wasn't a prepper's basement or a hunter's cache. This was organized, maintained, recent. The rations had expiration dates 2 years from now. The generator had no dust on it. The radio was warm. This was an operation, and it was active. Cade took 1 step back, then another. His heel hit the bottom stair, and he turned, ready to climb, ready to run, ready to pretend he had never lifted that first board. Then he heard it, not from below, from above, a sound that stopped his blood cold. An engine, distant but approaching, growing louder by the second. Then a second engine joined the first. Heavy vehicles, moving fast, coming up the road or whatever passed for a road out here toward the cabin. Tires crunching over gravel, brakes squealing, doors opening, slamming shut. 1, 2, 3. Voices, low, sharp, controlled. Men who weren't surprised to be here. Men who came here often. Cade killed the flashlight instantly. The bunker plunged into total darkness. He pressed himself against the wall, next to the stairs, barely breathing. Above him, the cabin door opened. No creak this time. Someone pushed it wide and walked in with the confidence of ownership. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor, straight toward the kitchen. Then a pause, a long, terrible pause. A voice cut through the silence. Calm, cold. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. "Someone's been here." A second voice. "Hatch is exposed." "I can see that." Cade's lungs burned. He hadn't taken a breath in what felt like minutes. His fingers pressed against the concrete wall so hard they ached. Above him, the footsteps stopped right at the edge of the open hatch. He could hear them breathing. "Clear it," the first voice ordered. Metal scraped, the sound of a rifle being readied. A small object clinked against the hatch frame. Cade's mind raced. They were going to come down. Or worse, they were going to drop something down. A flashbang, a grenade, something that would end this before it started. Then the world cracked open. A gunshot, not from inside the cabin, from outside, sharp, precise echoing off the hills like a whip crack. One of the men upstairs cursed. A second shot followed closer. Glass shattered somewhere. Then a third shot, and with it a deep, heavy whomp as something ignited. The cabin lit up orange, shouting, boots pounding in different directions. "We've got company." More gunfire coming fast now, overlapping the sharp reports of rifles, mixing with the deeper boom of something larger. Cade didn't wait. He surged up the stairs, keeping low, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. The cabin was filling with smoke, thick and acrid, pouring in from outside where one of the trucks had caught fire. Through the broken window he could see it. A large pickup tilted at an angle, front tire shredded flames climbing from a spilled gas can underneath the chassis. The fire threw wild shadows across the trees, turning the clearing into a shifting, chaotic stage of light and dark. Cade stumbled toward the front door. Two men were crouched behind the second truck, firing into the tree line at something he couldn't see. A third was trying to put out the fire, but another shot rang out and he dropped flat, scrambling for cover. The front door was open. The porch was right there. Beyond it, the forest. If he ran now in the smoke and the chaos, maybe they wouldn't see him. He ran. His boots hit the porch and the wood groaned dangerously. He leaped off the side, hit the ground hard, rolled once, and scrambled to his feet. "Move, kid." The voice came from the tree line, 20 yards away, maybe less. Cade turned and saw him. An older man stepped out from behind a thick oak, a bolt-action rifle held steady in both hands. Late 60s, maybe older. Tall, but not broad. Lean, like the kind of lean that comes from years of living on very little. A weathered face carved with deep lines, gray beard trimmed short, and eyes that were sharp and clear and completely unsurprised. He looked at Cade the way a man looks at a problem he expected but didn't want. "What are you standing there for?" The man said, his voice rough, clipped, impatient. "You want to die in that shack?" Cade didn't argue. He ran. They moved fast through the trees, the old man leading with a sureness that said he knew this forest the way most people know their own house. Every turn was deliberate. Every step landed on solid ground. Behind them, the shouting grew louder. More gunfire cracked through the woods, bullets snapping against bark and ricocheting off stone. They ran for what felt like miles. Up a ridge, across a creek bed, through a thicket so dense Cade had to turn sideways to push through. The old man never slowed, never looked back. Finally, when the sounds of pursuit had faded to something distant and uncertain, the man stopped. A rocky outcrop overlooking a dark valley. The burning truck was a faint orange dot far below. Cade bent over, the hands on his knees, gasping. Every muscle in his body screamed. His lungs felt like they were full of glass. "Who?" he managed between breaths. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He stood at the edge of the outcrop, scanning the ridge below, listening to the forest with the practiced stillness of someone who had done this before, many times before. Finally, without turning, he spoke. "Name's Harlan." His tone was flat, rough, like gravel dragged over stone. "I've been watching that cabin for 2 years, he said, as if that explained everything. Cade straightened up. His breathing was slowing, but his heart wasn't. Watching it for what? Harlan turned and looked at him, really looked. The way Marlene had looked at him in the county office, like he was measuring something, deciding something. "You really don't know what you walked into, do you?" Cade shook his head slowly. Harlan let out a breath, not a sigh, something heavier, something that carried weight. "That cabin isn't abandoned, kid. It hasn't been for a long time. It's a waypoint, a stash house, weapons, ammunition, equipment. It moves through that bunker and disappears into the hills. Been that way for years." Cade felt his stomach drop, a slow, sinking sensation that started in his chest and settled somewhere near the bottom of his spine. "I just bought that place," he said quietly. $10. Harlan stared at him. For a second, something moved behind those sharp eyes. Not pity, something more complicated. Then a dry, humorless sound escaped his throat. Not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of one. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured." Another burst of shouting echoed up from the valley, faint but persistent. They were regrouping down there, organizing, coming. Harlan's expression hardened instantly. Whatever softness had cracked through was gone. "Listen to me," he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped, not quieter, heavier. "You're in this now, whether you want to be or not. Those men down there don't leave loose ends. You've seen the bunker. You've seen the weapons. That means you're either with them or you're a problem. And they don't solve problems with conversation." Cade swallowed. The night air was freezing against his sweat-soaked shirt. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, but he held Harlan's gaze. "I didn't ask for this. Nobody ever does." Harlan reached behind a rock and pulled out a small pack. Pre-staged, ready, he handed it to Cade. Inside a water bottle, a wrapped bundle of jerky, a folding knife, and a compact first aid kit. Quick, efficient, like he had done this 100 times. "Stay low," Harlan said. "Follow exactly where I step, and whatever happens, don't panic." Cade shouldered the pack. His hands were still shaking, but he tightened the straps and stood straight. "Where are we going?" Harlan looked east into the dark forest that stretched for miles in every direction and said nothing for a long moment, then quietly, more to himself than to Cade, deeper. They moved into the darkness together, the old man and the kid. And behind them, far below, the cabin still burned, orange light flickering against the trees. A $10 house on fire in the middle of nowhere. And for the first time since he raised his hand in that diner, Cade understood exactly what he had bought. Not a home, not yet. A war. They moved through the forest for hours without speaking. Harlan set the pace, and the pace was punishing. Not fast and wacky, but relentless. A steady grinding rhythm that never slowed, never paused, never offered a moment to catch breath or gather thought. He moved through the dark woods like water through stone, finding paths where none existed, stepping over roots and rocks, with the instinct of a man who had walked this land so many times it had become part of his body. Cade followed. He had no choice. The darkness was absolute. Without Harlan's shape ahead of him, a shadow slightly darker than the rest, he would have been blind, lost within minutes, dead within hours. The temperature kept dropping. The sweat from the run had soaked through his shirt and now clung to his skin like a second layer of cold. Every breath came out in a thin, white cloud that dissolved instantly into the freezing air. His legs burned, his feet ached. The straps of the pack Harlan had given him dug into his shoulders, and the weight of it, small as it was, felt heavier with every step. But he kept moving, because behind them, somewhere in the dark valley, they had left men with guns were doing the same. Around midnight, or what Cade guessed was midnight, Harlan stopped. No warning, no signal. He just stopped, and Cade nearly walked into his back. They were on a narrow ridge, the ground falling away sharply on both sides into darkness. A thin wind moved along the top like a current carrying the smell of pine and wet stone. Harlan crouched. Cade did the same. For a long time, neither of them moved. Harlan listened. Not casually, not the way a person listens to the radio or a conversation across a room, but with his entire body. Head tilted slightly, jaw set, eyes not searching the darkness but receiving it, absorbing every sound the forest offered. Cade listened too, but all he heard was his own heartbeat and the low moan of wind through bare branches. Finally, Harlan spoke, barely above a whisper. "They split up." Cade blinked. "How do you know?" "Because the sound changed. One group was moving east along the creek. Heavy, loud. That stopped 10 minutes ago. Means they hit the bluff and turned. The other group went south, quieter, smarter. Those are the ones that matter." Cade stared at the old man's profile in the dark. "You can hear all that?" Harlan didn't answer the question. He stood, adjusted the rifle on his shoulder, and started moving again. "Step where I step," he said. "Nowhere else." They descended the ridge on its western face, a route so steep Cade had to use his hands in places, grabbing roots and stone to keep from sliding. Harlan moved down it like it was a staircase. At the bottom, a shallow creek ran over flat rocks, the water barely an inch deep, but ice cold. Harlan walked straight into it, not across, along it, upstream. His boots made no sound on the smooth stone. Cade understood without being told. No footprints, no trail. The water erased everything. They followed the creek for almost a mile before Harlan turned off onto a flat rock shelf that connected to a deer trail running north. From there, they climbed again, switchbacking up through dense cedar until they reached a small clearing shielded on three sides by rock. Harlan stopped. "We rest here. 1 hour." Cade dropped to the ground like his strings had been cut. Every muscle in his body pulsed with a dull, throbbing heat. He pulled the water bottle from the pack and drank. Not too much. He didn't know when he'd get more. Harlan didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the clearing, facing South rifle resting across his forearm, watching. "You should eat," he said without turning. Cade opened the wrapped bundle of jerky, venison, tough and dry and slightly smoky. He tore off a piece and chewed slowly. It was the best thing he'd tasted since the soup at the diner. "Thank you," Cade said. Harlan said nothing. "For the food," Cade added. "For the pack, for back there at the cabin." "All of it." Silence. Then without turning, Harlan said, "Don't thank me yet." They moved again before the hour was up. Harlan seemed to operate on an internal clock that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with distance. The gap between them and the men behind them was a living thing, and Harlan treated it that way. Something that needed constant feeding. As they walked, Harlan began to teach. Not formally, not like a classroom or a lesson, more like corrections. Small clipped observations delivered in the same rough tone he used for everything else. "You're dragging your left foot. Lift it. Every drag leaves a mark. Don't grab that branch. Greenwood snaps loud. Deadwood breaks quiet. Stop looking at the ground. Look ahead. The ground will tell your feet what to do if you let it." Cade absorbed it all, not because he wanted to learn wilderness survival, but because the alternative was dying. The motivation was remarkably clarifying. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the canopy, they had covered what Cade estimated was 8 or 9 miles. His body felt like it had been taken apart and put back together wrong. But he was still moving, still breathing, still alive. They stopped on a high bluff overlooking a wide valley choked with fog. Below, the forest stretched in every direction, an unbroken sea of gray and brown. No roads, no buildings. No sign that the world Cade had known 2 days ago still existed. Harlan sat down for the first time. He leaned against a boulder, set the rifle across his lap, and pulled out a canteen from somewhere inside his coat. He drank slowly, eyes still scanning the valley. Cade sat a few feet away. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't hostile anymore. It was just silence. The kind that happens between two people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the space with noise. But Cade had questions, too many of them, and they were starting to press against the inside of his chest like a fist. 2 years, Cade said quietly. Harlan looked at him. "You said you've been watching that cabin for 2 years. Why?" Harlan's jaw tightened. He looked away, out over the foggy valley, and for a long moment, Cade thought he wasn't going to answer. The wind moved through the trees below them, making the fog shift and curl like something alive. Then Harlan spoke, and his voice for the first time was not rough. It was flat, emptied out. The voice of a man who had told himself this story so many times it had worn smooth like a stone in a river. "I had a son." The words landed between them with a weight that didn't match their size. "His name was Nolan. Good kid. Quiet. Liked being out here more than being in town. He could track a deer across bare rock. Could read the weather by the way the birds moved. 20 years old and already more at home in these woods than most men are after a lifetime." Harlan paused. His thumb traced a slow line along the stock of the rifle. 3 years ago, Nolan was out hunting the East Ridge, about 6 miles from your cabin. He was alone. I had told him to stay on the marked trails, but he never listened. Got that from his mother." Another pause, longer this time. Cade didn't move, didn't breathe. He saw something, down in a hollow near one of the old logging roads. Men loading crates into trucks. Military-style crates. The same kind you saw in that bunker. He didn't know what it was. He was just a kid watching something he didn't understand. But they saw him. Harlan's voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It just went quiet like a light being turned down. They found him the next morning at the bottom of a ravine, 30-foot drop onto rock. The sheriff's office ruled it a fall, Said he must have lost his footing in the dark. Hunting accident. Case closed. They didn't even send anyone to look at the ridge where it happened. Cade's throat tightened. He could feel the shape of what was coming, and it pressed against him like the cold. I went up there myself, Harlan continued. Found the spot where he fell. The ground was torn up. Not from a slip, from a fight. Boot prints that weren't his. Broken branches at chest height, not ankle height. And the edge of that ravine, the rock was clean. No moss disturbed, no scuff marks. He didn't fall. He was thrown. The fog below them had begun to thin. Shafts of pale sunlight cut through the canopy in the valley, turning patches of forest gold. I took what I found to the sheriff. He looked at it, said it was inconclusive, said grief makes people see things, told me to go home and get some rest. Harlan's lip curled slightly, not a smile, something darker. That's when I started paying attention, started watching the roads, the logging trails, the cabins, and I found it, the operation. Weapons moving in and out of those hills like a supply chain. And the man running it, the man who ordered my boy killed. Who? Cade asked, though the question felt almost unnecessary. He already knew the answer would change everything. His name is Voss. The name landed hard, one syllable, short and sharp as a blade. Military background, decorated. Left the service 15 years ago and set up here in the Ozarks. Runs a network. Weapons mostly. Stolen surplus black market. Uses abandoned properties across the hills as waypoints. Your cabin is one of 6, maybe more. Each one has a bunker. Each one feeds into a distribution line that moves product south and west. Cade let out a slow breath. And nobody knows. People know. They just don't care enough to do anything about it. Or they're too scared. Voss has connections, local law enforcement, county officials, people who look the other way because looking straight ahead is too dangerous. Then why are you still here? Why haven't you gone to the feds? Harlan looked at him, a long, steady look. Because I don't have proof, I have observations, patterns, suspicions, 2 years of watching and waiting, and none of it adds up to enough for anyone with a badge to care. Voss is careful. Everything is compartmentalized. Nothing leads back to him on paper. The wind picked up. Cade pulled his jacket tighter. So what was your plan? He asked. Harlan didn't answer for a moment. Then quietly, I was going to wait, watch, and when the right moment came, take it. Take what? Whatever I could. They sat with that for a while. The valley below slowly emerged from the fog like a painting being revealed one layer at a time. Beautiful if you could forget what was hiding in it. I'm sorry, Cade said, about Nolan. Harlan didn't respond. He just stood up, shouldered the rifle, and started walking again. The day passed in a blur of movement and exhaustion. They stayed high, following ridge lines and rock shelves that offered visibility but minimal cover. Harlan was more cautious now, stopping frequently to listen, scanning the forest below, with an intensity that told Cade something had changed. They brought more men, Harlan said around midday, crouching behind a fallen tree and studying the valley floor through a gap in the branches. 2 more trucks came in from the south. I can see the tracks. How many total? Enough. They pushed north away from the cabin deeper into terrain that grew wilder and more broken with every mile. The hills steepened. The trees thinned in places, replaced by exposed rock and scrub brush that offered nowhere to hide. Twice they had to cross open ground, sprinting from one tree line to the next, while Harlan watched the back trail with the rifle raised. The second time Cade heard something. Distant but unmistakable. Voices, carried on the wind from somewhere south, men calling to each other, coordinating, closing in. Harlan heard it too. His face didn't change, but his pace did. Faster now, more urgent. By late afternoon, they reached a steep descent along a dry creek bed, loose rock and gravel. Harlan went first, moving sideways, placing each foot with care. Cade was 10 feet behind when it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the valley. Not a branch, not a rock. A rifle shot. The sound hit the hills and bounced, making it impossible to tell the direction. Harlan flinched. A small, tight movement. His left leg buckled for just a second. Then he caught himself straightened and kept moving. Not faster, not slower. The same steady pace, like nothing had happened. But Cade saw it. The flinch, the momentary break in the rhythm that hadn't broken once in 24 hours. Harlan, keep moving. Are you hit? I said keep moving. They made it to the bottom of the creek bed and crossed into a thick stand of cedar on the other side. Harlan led them up a short rise and into a narrow gap between two rock formations, a natural shelter barely wide enough for both of them, hidden from every direction. Harlan sat down hard. Not the controlled descent of a man choosing to rest. The collapse of a man who couldn't stand anymore. Cade saw the blood. Harlan's left pant leg was dark from the knee down. Not soaked through yet, but spreading. A steady, patient stain that grew wider as Cade watched. Let me see it. It's a graze. Let me see it. Harlan looked at him for a second. Something moved in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or something else. Then he shifted his leg and pulled the fabric up. The wound was along the outer calf. Not deep, but not clean. The bullet had carved a trench through the skin and muscle, leaving a ragged furrow about 4 inches long. Blood seeped from it steadily, not pulsing, which meant no artery, but enough to be a problem. Cade opened the first aid kit from the pack. His hands were steady. That surprised him. Everything inside was shaking his stomach, his thoughts, his heart, but his hands were steady. He cleaned the wound with the antiseptic wipes from the kit. Harlan didn't make a sound, but his jaw locked tight, and the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. Cade pressed a folded gauze pad over the furrow and wrapped it with the elastic bandage tight, but not too tight. Field dressing. He didn't know where he'd learned it. Maybe from a book. Maybe from nowhere. Maybe from the same place in him that had made him raise his hand in that diner. How long have you been bleeding? Cade asked. Since the creek bed. That was an hour ago. Yeah. Why didn't you say something? Harlan looked at him with an expression that was almost insulted. Because we were being shot at. Cade tied off the bandage. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. The bleeding slowed. Harlan leaned back against the rock and closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, they were slightly unfocused. The first sign of something Cade didn't want to think about. You need real medical attention, Cade said. What I need is for those men to stop following us. That too. Night fell again, faster than the night before, or maybe it just felt that way because Cade was paying more attention to how much light they had left. The gap between the rocks offered some protection from the wind, but none from the cold. Cade gave Harlan the remaining jerky in the last of the water. Harlan argued. Cade insisted. It wasn't a long argument. By midnight, Harlan was running a fever. Cade could feel the heat coming off him in waves radiating through the cold air like a stove. The older man's breathing had changed too. Shallower, faster. His eyes opened and closed at irregular intervals, and when they opened, they took longer each time to find focus. Cade, I'm here. Listen to me. Harlan's voice was lower now, rougher, stripped of its usual edge, leaving something raw underneath. About a mile east of here, there's an old fire road. Runs north-south through the valley. You follow it north, you'll hit a county road within 6 miles. From there, you can get to a town. Get help. Call someone. I'm not leaving you. This isn't a discussion. You're right, it's not. Harlan stared at him. Even through the fever, those eyes still had force. They pushed, tested, tried to find the crack. Kid, you don't owe me anything. Cade almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so far from the point that it barely existed on the same map. My whole life, Cade said slowly, people walked away. Social workers, foster parents, kids I thought were friends, everyone, every single one. They got close enough to matter, and then they left. And every time I told myself the same thing, it's fine, you're fine, you don't need anyone. He paused. The wind moved through the gap in the rocks, carrying the smell of pine and frozen earth. I'm done walking away from things, even if it's the smart thing to do. Harlan didn't respond right away. He studied Cade the way he'd studied the forest, the way he read terrain and sound and movement, looking for something underneath the surface. Whatever he found, it changed his expression. The resistance softened. Not into warmth exactly. Harlan wasn't built for warmth, but into something adjacent. Acceptance maybe, or recognition. The look of a man seeing something in someone else that he had lost in himself a long time ago. All right, Harlan said quietly. So what's your plan? Cade hadn't expected the question. Or maybe he had because the answer had been forming in the back of his mind since the bunker. Since the moment his flashlight swept across those shelves and he understood what was underneath that cabin, he picked up a stick and cleared a flat patch of dirt in front of him. The bunker, Cade said. He drew a rough square in the dirt. Concrete walls, steel hatch, 12 feet down. The entrance is through the kitchen floor of the cabin. He drew a line extending from the square. The ventilation system. I saw the vents, two of them. One near the entrance, one on the far wall. They run up through the ground and exit somewhere outside the cabin, probably near the tree line on the north side. That's how the air circulates down there. Harlan watched, said nothing. Cade drew another shape. The generator. It runs on gasoline. There was a full fuel can next to it, 5 gallons, maybe more. And the ammunition, dozens of boxes, all stored together on the same wall. He looked up at Harlan. Gasoline, ammunition, confined concrete space with 2 ventilation shafts. Harlan's eyes sharpened. The fever was still there, pulling at his focus, but something in Cade's words cut through it. You're talking about turning the bunker into a bomb. I'm talking about using what's already there. The ventilation shafts are the key. If you introduce fire through the external vent, it feeds straight into the bunker. The gasoline ignites first. Then the heat reaches the ammunition. In a sealed concrete space that's not a fire. That's a detonation. Harlan looked at the crude map in the dirt for a long time. His breathing was rough, uneven, but his mind was working. Cade could see it behind those eyes. Calculating. Weighing. The vent exits, Harlan said slowly. You'd need to know exactly where they are. I do. I saw the pipes when I was down there. The north vent runs about 20 feet from the cabin wall. It would exit near the big cedar cluster on the north side of the clearing. And you'd need to get Voss and his men into the blast radius. Cade nodded. That's the hard part. That's not the hard part, Harlan said. The hard part is getting their attention, drawing them back to the cabin, making them commit to the location instead of spreading through the forest. Cade set the stick down. I know. You'd have to be the bait. I know. The silence that followed was longer than any they had shared. The wind died down. The forest went still. Somewhere far away, an owl called once and received no answer. Harlan looked at Cade, not at the 18-year-old kid who had bought a cabin for $10, not at the foster kid with $53 and no plan. At the person underneath all of that, the one who stayed when everyone else left, the one who was drawing battle plans in the dirt with a stick, while a wounded old man bled beside him in the dark. Your plan has a lot of ways to go wrong, Harlan said. I know. If the wind shifts, the fire goes the wrong way. If they don't follow you, it's for nothing. If the vent is blocked or the gas has been moved, you're standing in a clearing surrounded by armed men with no exit. I know. And if it works, you'll be 30 yards from a bunker full of burning ammunition and high-octane fuel. The blast radius on something like that in a confined underground space. It won't just burn, it'll collapse. The ground itself will give way. I know. Harlan shook his head slowly, a grim, slight movement. You know everything and you still want to do it. Cade met his eyes. What's the alternative? We keep running. You can barely walk. They've got trucks. They've got numbers, and they know this forest. Eventually they find us. And then it's over. Not on our terms. On theirs. He let that sit for a moment. At least this way we choose. We pick the ground. We pick the moment. And if it goes wrong because we tried, not because we gave up. Harlan said nothing for a long time. The fever had put a glassy sheen over his eyes, but behind it something burned that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked at the map in the dirt one more time, traced the ventilation lines with his gaze, measured the distances. Then he looked at Cade. There's a position on the south ridge, Harlan said slowly, about 200 yards from the cabin, clear line of sight to the clearing and the north tree line. I can set up there with the rifle. Your leg. My leg will get me up a hill. It just won't get me back down. Cade started to argue, but Harlan cut him off. I don't need to run, I need to shoot. 200 yards I can put a round through a gas can the size of a lunchbox. That's my part. The vent, the fire, the bait. That's yours. Cade swallowed. His throat was dry. The cold pressed in from every side, and somewhere out in the darkness, men with rifles were getting closer by the hour. When Cade asked, tomorrow night, we rest through the day, move at dusk, you approach from the east. I take the ridge. You draw them in. I wait for your signal. What signal? Harlan almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, and for a fraction of a second, Cade saw something in the old man's face that might have been pride. Or fear. Or both at once. I'll know, Harlan said. Just make sure you're clear when it goes. Cade nodded. His heart was pounding. Not with fear, not exactly. Something else. Something that felt like the opposite of everything he had known for 18 years. Every home that wasn't his. Every door that closed. Every person who turned away. He was staying. He was choosing this. And for the first time in his life, someone was choosing to stay with him. Get some sleep, Harlan said, leaning back against the rock and closing his eyes. Tomorrow's going to be the longest day of your life. Cade didn't sleep, not right away. He sat in the dark listening to Harlan's labored breathing, watching the stars through the gap in the rocks above. Tiny points of light in an ocean of black, constant and indifferent and impossibly far away. He thought about the diner, the cracked mug, the soup, the image of a ruined cabin on a television screen that nobody was watching. He thought about Marlene at the county office, the way she had held on to the deed just a beat too long, the card with the phone number. Someone who knows that land better than anyone in this county. He thought about Nolan, a 20-year-old kid who liked the woods more than town, who tracked deer across bare rock, who saw something he shouldn't have and paid for it at the bottom of a ravine. A boy about his own age, a boy whose father had been living alone in the forest for 2 years, carrying a grief so heavy it had hollowed him out and filled the empty space with purpose. And he thought about himself. Cade, nobody's son, nobody's brother, nobody's anything. Sitting in a gap between two rocks in the Ozark wilderness, planning an assault on an armed weapons operation with nothing but a stick and a crude map drawn in dirt. It should have terrified him, and part of it did. The rational part, the part that had learned to count exits and measure risks and always keep one foot pointed toward the door. But there was another part, deeper, older, the part that had raised its hand in a diner full of people who laughed, the part that signed a deed without knowing what was underneath the floor. That part was not afraid. That part was awake, and it whispered something simple into the cold, dark silence of the Ozark night. This is yours now, all of it. The cabin, the danger, the choice. Don't let go. They spent the day in the rocks. Harlan drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, his breathing rough and uneven, his skin radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the pale winter sun filtering through the gap above them. The fever was getting worse. Cade could see it in the way the old man's hands trembled when they rested on the rifle stock, in the way his eyes, when they opened, took 3 or 4 seconds longer than they should have to find the world again. Cade changed the bandage twice. Both times the gauze came away dark and heavy. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. The wound wasn't killing Harlan. Not yet. But it was draining him one slow hour at a time, pulling something out of him that sleep and jerky couldn't put back. Around midday, Cade climbed to the top of the rock formation and looked south. The forest spread out below in every direction, quiet and still under a colorless sky. No movement, no sound, no sign of the men who were hunting them. That was worse than seeing them, because it meant they were being patient. Impatient men with guns were more dangerous than angry ones. He climbed back down and found Harlan awake, sitting upright against the rock wall with the canteen in his hand. Empty. He was staring at the map Cade had drawn in the dirt the night before. The lines were still there, faint but legible. The square of the bunker, the ventilation shafts, the clearing. Wind's coming from the northwest, Harlan said without looking up. His voice was thinner than yesterday, stripped down to wire and gravel. That's good. It'll push the fire south through the vent, away from your approach line. Cade sat down across from him. How's the leg? Still attached. That's not what I asked. Harlan finally looked at him. Something close to irritation flickered across his face, but it didn't quite land. Underneath it was something else. A quiet acknowledgement that the balance between them had shifted. That the kid asking the questions was no longer just a kid. I can make the ridge, Harlan said. I can set up. I can shoot. After that, we'll see. Cade nodded. He didn't push further. There was nothing to gain from forcing a man like Harlan to admit what they both already knew. The leg was bad. The fever was worse. And after tonight, one way or another, the running was over. They went over the plan twice more. Each time Cade drew it fresh in the dirt, tracing the same lines, the same distances, the same sequence. Repetition wasn't about memorization. It was about finding the holes, the places where the plan could tear. The vent exit on the north side, Cade said. I need to confirm it's there. If they capped it or covered it, the whole thing falls apart. You'll have to check it before you start making noise, before they know you're there. I know. I'll come in from the east through the cedar thicket. Circle north, find the vent, confirm it's open, then swing back south and start drawing them in. In the fire, Cade pulled the folding knife from the pack and held it up. Next to it, a strip of fabric torn from the lining of his jacket and the small waterproof match case he had found in the first aid kit. 3 matches. That was all. I stuffed the fabric into the vent opening. Light it. The draft will pull the flame down into the shaft. Once it reaches the bunker, the gasoline does the rest. And you run. And I run. Harlan studied him. How far from the vent to the tree line? Maybe 30 yards. 30 yards from a hole in the ground connected to 5 gallons of gasoline and a room full of ammunition. I'll run fast. Harlan didn't laugh. He looked at the dirt map one more time, then rubbed it out with his boot. No evidence. No trace. When the explosion hits, Harlan said slowly, the ground around the cabin is going to collapse. The bunker's concrete, but the soil above it isn't reinforced. The blast will blow upward through the vents in the hatch and the structure above will cave. Everything within 50 feet of the cabin is going to drop. I know. So you better be at 60. The sun moved across the sky in a low, indifferent arc. By 4 o'clock, the shadows had stretched long and the temperature was falling. The forest below turned from brown to purple to black as the light bled out of the valley. Cade stood. His body was stiff, sore in places he didn't know could be sore. But his mind was clear. Sharper than it had been in days. Maybe sharper than it had ever been. Every thought pointed in one direction. Harlan pulled himself up using the rock wall, putting most of his weight on his right leg. His jaw was set, his lips pressed thin against the pain. He picked up the rifle, checked the bolt, checked the magazine. 3 rounds. He had 3 rounds left. That's enough, he said, reading the look on Cade's face. I only need 2. They left the rocks at dusk, separated at the dry creek bed. Harlan went south toward the ridge. Cade went east toward the cabin. The plan was simple. The plan had to be simple because simple plans had fewer places to break. They didn't shake hands, didn't say good luck. Harlan just looked at Cade for a long moment, then nodded once. Cade nodded back. And then they turned away from each other and walked into the darkening forest, alone. Cade moved through the woods the way Harlan had taught him. Slow, deliberate, weight on the back foot before committing to the front. Eyes up, not down, listening to the forest instead of fighting it. The lessons were only 2 days old, but they had been written into his body by exhaustion and fear and the simple biological imperative of staying alive. The night closed in around him. Complete darkness. No moon. The clouds had moved in during the afternoon and sealed the sky like a lid. Cade navigated by memory and feel, counting his steps, measuring distance by the slope of the ground and the density of the trees. It took him 2 hours to reach the eastern edge of the clearing. He crouched behind a fallen log and let his eyes adjust. The cabin was there, a dark shape against slightly less dark surroundings. No lights inside, no vehicles visible. But he could smell something. Cigarette smoke, faint and fresh, carried on the northwest wind. Someone was there, maybe more than one. Cade waited, watched, counted his breaths. After 10 minutes, he saw movement. A figure walking the perimeter of the clearing, slow and casual. A guard, one man, rifle slung across his chest. He walked south along the tree line, turned, walked north. A circuit, every 3 minutes. Cade timed it twice more to be sure. 3 minutes. Predictable. Bored. The man was going through the motions, not expecting trouble. Not expecting an 18-year-old kid to come back to the place he had barely escaped 2 nights ago. When the guard turned south, Cade moved. He circled wide, staying inside the tree line, moving north around the clearing. The cedar thicket was exactly where he remembered it. Dense enough to hide in. Close enough to the north side of the cabin to reach the vent. He pushed through the cedars on his hands and knees, branches scraping his face and arms. The ground was soft here, covered in a thick layer of dead needles that muffled every movement. He came out on the other side and stopped. There, 6 feet from the tree line. A metal pipe maybe 4 inches in diameter, rising about 8 inches out of the ground. The ventilation shaft. The top was covered with a simple wire mesh screen, rusted but intact. Not capped, not sealed. Open. Cade put his hand over it and felt the air. A faint, steady current of warmth rising from below. The bunker was breathing. He pulled the strip of fabric from his pocket. Then the match case. He opened it with fingers that were steady only because he willed them to be. 3 matches. He set 2 aside and held the third. Not yet. First the bait. Cade moved back through the cedars and circled east again. He needed distance from the vent. Needed the explosion to happen after he was clear, not while he was standing on top of it. He positioned himself at the southeastern corner of the clearing, maybe 80 yards from the cabin, deep enough in the trees to have a running start, close enough to be heard. He closed his eyes, took 1 breath, 2, 3. Then he started making noise. He crashed through a thicket of dry brush, snapped branches, kicked deadfall. The sounds ripped through the silent forest like gunshots. Every instinct he had screamed at him to stop, to hide, to be quiet. He ignored all of them. "Hey," he shouted. His voice cracked, broke, then came back stronger. "I'm right here." The reaction was immediate. The guard in the clearing spun. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping the tree line. Cade saw 2 more lights appear inside the cabin. Voices sharp and urgent. "Over there, east side." "How many?" "Sounds like 1. Cade kept moving, kept crashing, led them away from the north side, away from the vent, pulling their attention southeast like a thread unraveling from a spool. More men emerged from the cabin. 4. No 5. Flashlights bouncing, rifles up. They spread out along the clearing's edge and started moving toward the sound. Cade turned and ran, not away from the cabin, parallel to it, south along the tree line, making enough noise for 3 people. His lungs burned. Branches whipped across his face. He could hear them behind him, boots on dirt commands being shouted. Then he cut west, sharp turn, 90 degrees, straight back toward the cabin, straight through the gap in their line that had opened when they all pushed southeast. It was the one thing they wouldn't expect. The prey doesn't run toward the trap. He burst out of the tree line and into the clearing on the cabin's west side. For 3 terrible seconds, he was completely exposed. Open ground. No cover, just dead grass and moonless dark in the shape of the ruined cabin 10 yards to his right. Nobody saw him. They were all in the trees to the southeast, chasing the noise he had already left behind. Cade sprinted north, around the cabin, past the collapsed porch, past the shattered windows where smoke still stained the wood from 2 nights ago. He reached the cedar thicket and dove in. The vent pipe was right where he left it. His hands shook now, not from cold, from everything. He pulled out the fabric strip and stuffed it into the mesh screen, pushing it down into the pipe with the folding knife until it caught on the inner wall. Half the fabric hung out the top. The other half dangled inside the shaft, right in the path of the warm rising air. He opened the match case, took the first match, struck it. Nothing. The head crumbled, damp, dead. Cade's heart stopped. He grabbed the second match. His fingers were trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. He struck it hard against the case. A spark, a hiss, a small, perfect flame. He touched it to the fabric. The fire caught, crawled up the strip. Then the draft from below took it. The flame bent, pulled downward into the pipe, and disappeared into the earth. Cade ran. He didn't count yards. He didn't look back. He ran straight north into the cedars, crashing through branches, tearing his jacket, stumbling over roots. 30 yards. 40. 50. Behind him, the men were shouting again. They had realized they were chasing nothing in the southeast. Flashlights swung back toward the cabin. Someone saw the smoke rising from the vent pipe. A voice called out, "Something's burning." Where? North side, the vent. Someone lit the goddamn vent. Then a different voice, coming not from the trees, not from the search party, but from the cabin itself, from the front porch. Come on. Unhurried. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it carries authority all on its own. "Bring the boy." Cade froze. He was 60 yards out, maybe 70, hidden in the cedars, crouched behind a deadfall. He should have kept running, should have put another 100 yards between himself and the blast. But the voice stopped him, because it was the same voice he had heard from the bunker 2 nights ago. The same cold, measured tone that had said, "Someone's been here." Through a gap in the branches, Cade saw him. A man stood on the ruined porch of the cabin, tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested a lifetime of physical discipline, not vanity. Dark jacket, no hat, hair cut short and gray at the temples. He stood with his hands at his sides, no weapon visible, and he looked out into the forest with the patience of someone who had been in control of every situation he had ever entered. Voss. The men regrouped around him, 5 of them, armed, agitated. But Voss didn't move, didn't shout. He just stood there watching the tree line to the north as if he could see through the darknesses, through the cedars, through everything straight to where Cade was crouching. Then Voss spoke, not to his men, to the forest, to Cade. "I know you're there, kid." The words carried through the cold air with perfect clarity. "You came back. That tells me something. You're either brave or stupid, and in my experience, those are usually the same thing." One of the men moved toward the vent, reaching for the smoke. Voss held up a hand. The man stopped. "You think you're fighting for something, don't you? That cabin. That deed with your name on it. You think it means something." Voss stepped off the porch, slowly, casually, like a man taking an evening walk. "Let me tell you what it means. Nothing. That property has been in the county's foreclosure system for 6 years. Nobody wanted it. Nobody claimed it. It just sat there rotting while I used what was underneath it. And when the county finally got around to auctioning it, I needed a name on the deed, a real name, someone clean, someone with no connections, no history, no one who would come looking." He stopped at the edge of the clearing, facing the cedars. "An orphan," Voss said, "fresh out of the system, no family, no friends, no record. The perfect signature on a piece of paper that makes my operation look like someone else's property." The words hit Cade like a fist to the sternum. He felt the air go out of him. The ground shifted. Everything he had believed about the last 3 days, the coincidence, the luck, the stubborn defiance of buying something no one else wanted, all of it tilted sideways. He hadn't found this place. He had been led to it. "You were never meant to stay," Voss continued. "You were meant to sign leave and disappear back into whatever hole the system spits kids like you into. But you didn't leave. You opened the hatch. You saw what was down there, and now we have a problem." Voss tilted his head slightly, almost curious. "I'm going to give you one chance. Walk away, right now, into those trees. Keep walking east until you hit a road. Find a bus. Go somewhere, anywhere. I'll put cash in your pocket and a new name on a new ID. You'll forget this place exists, and I'll forget you exist. That's the deal." The forest was silent. The smoke from the vent pipe rose in a thin gray line, barely visible against the dark sky. Cade's heart was hammering. His hands pressed flat against the cold ground. Every word Voss said made a terrible kind of sense. The auction, the price, the timing, all of it orchestrated, all of it designed. He had been a tool, a useful nobody, and for one flickering moment, the old instinct surfaced. The one that had kept him alive through 18 years of foster homes and group houses and empty parking lots. The one that said, "Run, survive, don't look back, don't fight battles that aren't yours." But then he thought about Harlan. Up on the ridge right now, dragging a wounded leg through the dark, setting up a position he might not be able to leave. Doing it anyway, because some things matter more than surviving. He thought about Nolan, a kid his age who saw something in a hollow and never came home. He thought about the bed at the foster center, the one that was never his, the room that was never home. The door that clicked shut behind him 3 days ago with the softest, most final sound he had ever heard. And he thought about the deed in his pocket, folded and creased and worth exactly $10, with his name on it, his. Cade stood up. He stepped out from behind the deadfall and into the gap between the cedars where Voss could see him, 80 yards apart. The armed men raised their rifles. Voss held up a hand. They waited. "Maybe you're right," Cade said. His voice didn't crack this time. "Maybe I was just a signature. Maybe none of this was supposed to be mine." He paused. But the name on that deed is my name, and this is my land, and I'm not going anywhere. Voss studied him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not surprise, disappointment maybe. The way a man looks at a problem that could have been avoided but now has to be dealt with. Get him, Voss said. The men moved, fast, spreading into the tree-lined flashlights, cutting through the dark rifles sweeping. Cade was already running. Not away, sideways. West, then south, then cutting back east in a wide arc that took him around the edge of the clearing. The same maneuver as before, but faster this time, more desperate. Branches tore at his face. His boots slipped on frozen ground. He could hear them crashing through the trees behind him, closing the distance. He broke through the south tree line and into the open clearing. The cabin was directly ahead. The vent pipe was behind him to the north. The smoke was still rising. The fire was still burning. Somewhere beneath his feet, the flame was working its way down the ventilation shaft, eating through fabric and oxygen, and reaching for the gasoline waiting at the bottom. Cade ran past the cabin, the porch, the shattered windows. He could feel the heat now. Or maybe he imagined it, a warmth rising up through the earth like the land itself had a fever. Voss was standing in the clearing. He hadn't moved, hadn't run. He watched Cade sprint past him with the expression of a man watching an animal do something predictable and doomed. "You're running out of ground, kid," Voss called. Cade didn't stop. He didn't turn. He ran straight for the western tree line, legs pumping, lungs screaming, and just before he reached the trees, he raised his right arm above his head. The signal, 200 yards south on the ridge, Harlan saw it. The first shot split the night in half, a deep, resonant crack that rolled across the valley like thunder. It struck the emergency fuel can sitting outside the cabin's east wall. The can ruptured. Gasoline sprayed across the ground in a wide, shining arc. The second shot came 3 seconds later. It hit the ground 2 feet from the ruptured edge, sparking off a rock buried in the soil. The gasoline caught. A wall of fire erupted along the east side of the cabin. The men in the tree line scrambled. Voss turned for the first time, his composure cracking as the flames climbed higher and faster than physics should have allowed. And then the bunker went. The sound wasn't a boom, it was a rupture. A deep, grinding tectonic detonation that started underground and tore its way upward through 12 feet of soil and concrete and wood. The cabin didn't explode. It collapsed. The center of the structure dropped straight down as the earth beneath it gave way, pulling walls and roof and porch into a pit that opened like a mouth. The shockwave hit Cade in the back. It threw him forward off his feet into the underbrush at the edge of the tree line. He hit the ground, hard, rolled, covered his head. Debris rained down around him, splintered wood, chunks of concrete, dirt and rock and ash. The sound went on for what felt like minutes, a cascading series of secondary detonations as the ammunition cooked off underground. Muffled pops and cracks, each one sending another shudder through the earth. The fire above ground spread fast, feeding on the dry timber of the collapsed structure, painting the forest in orange and red. Then silence. Not real silence. The fire still crackled and hissed. Somewhere in the wreckage, something metallic groaned and shifted. But the guns had stopped. The voices had stopped. The chase that had started 2 nights ago in this same clearing had finally completely stopped. Cade lay on his stomach in the frozen dirt, breathing hard. His ears rang. His vision swam. He tasted blood from where he had bitten his tongue during the fall. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood, there was now a crater. Not deep, but wide. The earth had swallowed the structure whole, pulling it down into the collapsed remains of the bunker. Fire burned at the edges, consuming what was left. Smoke rose in a thick column, black against the black sky, visible only by the way it had blocked out the stars. Of Voss and his men there was no sign. The clearing was empty. The trucks parked on the south side were damaged. One had been flipped by the shockwave. The other sat at an angle, windows shattered, tires melted. Cade staggered to his feet. His legs barely held him. He turned south and looked up at the ridge. A small light appeared. A single flash. Harlan's signal. Still there. Still alive. Cade's knees almost gave out. Not from exhaustion, from something else entirely. Something he didn't have a name for. Relief didn't cover it. Gratitude didn't cover it. It was bigger than both. Deeper. He started walking south, one foot in front of the other, toward the ridge, toward Harlan, toward whatever came next. He found the old man exactly where he said he would be, a flat rock on the south ridge, 200 yards from the clearing. Harlan was lying on his side rifle beside him, his face pale and slick with sweat. The bandage on his leg had soaked through again. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were open. And when he saw Cade coming through the trees, something moved across his face that he would have denied if anyone had asked about it later. "Took you long enough," Harlan said. Cade dropped to his knees beside him. "You hit both shots." "I told you I only needed two." He coughed, winced. "The third was insurance. Didn't need it." "Can you walk?" "Not even a little." Cade looked down the ridge. The fire was still burning in the clearing below. It would burn for hours, and when it was done, the smoke and the light would bring people, rangers, fire crews, eventually law enforcement, the kind that didn't answer to Voss. "Then we wait," Cade said. Harlan didn't argue. He closed his eyes and let his head rest against the rock. His breathing evened out slightly. Not better, just steadier. The fever was still there, but the tension that had held his body rigid for 3 days was finally releasing. Cade sat beside him and watched the fire. The warmth didn't reach them up here, but the light did. It flickered against the trees, casting long shadows that danced and shifted like something alive. Below the crater smoked and glowed. The Ozark forest stood around it, vast and silent and indifferent, the way it had stood for 1,000 years before Cade arrived and would stand for 1,000 more after he was gone. But right now in this moment, a small piece of it was his. They came at dawn, a county fire crew first, then state police, then men in windbreakers with federal badges who asked a lot of questions and wrote down everything. Harlan was airlifted to a hospital in Springfield. Cade rode in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a thermal blanket, answering questions in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone older. He told them everything. The auction, the cabin, the bunker, the weapons, the men, Voss. He told it straight, without drama, without embellishment, the way Harlan would have told it. Just the facts. Just what happened. They found the remains of the bunker 3 days later, after the fire burned out and the ground cooled enough to excavate. The federal agents confirmed what Cade already knew. It was a weapons cache, part of a larger network. 6 sites across the Ozarks, all using the same model. Abandoned properties. Underground storage. Supply lines running south and west. Voss's body was recovered from the collapsed bunker on the 4th day. The men who had worked for him scattered. Some were caught within the week. Others disappeared into the hills and were never found. The investigation lasted months. Cade was interviewed 7 times by 3 different agencies. He told the same story each time. He never changed a word. Harlan survived. The bullet wound got infected, and the fever nearly took him twice, but he was too stubborn to die in a hospital bed. That's what he said anyway. Cade visited him every week, making the drive from the motel where the county had put him up to the VA hospital in Springfield. They didn't talk much during those visits. Didn't need to. Cade would sit in the chair by the window, and Harlan would lie in the bed, and they would share the kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through something that words can't carry. When Harlan was discharged 6 weeks later, Cade was waiting in the parking lot. He had a truck. An old Ford bought for $800 from a lot outside of Camdenton. It ran rough and the heater only worked on the driver's side, but it ran. "Where are we going?" Harlan asked, lowering himself into the passenger seat with a grunt. "Home," Cade said. The property looked different in spring. The crater where the cabin had stood was still there, but grass had already started to reclaim the edges. The forest around it was alive with new growth, green, pushing up through the brown birdsong, filling the spaces that had been silent all winter. Cade had been working the land for 3 weeks by then, clearing debris, leveling ground, hauling lumber from a mill outside of Eldon. He had no training, no experience, and no money beyond what the county had provided as temporary housing assistance. But he had a deed with his name on it and a piece of land that he had earned in the most literal way a person can earn anything. He built the cabin himself, not the old one, a new one, smaller but solid, good bones, strong beams, fresh-cut pine that smelled like sawdust and sunlight. The foundation was poured concrete, level and square. The walls went up straight, the roof didn't sag. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, not at first. But every board he nailed, every joint he cut, every shingle he laid was his, placed by his hands on his land and his time. Harlan helped, or rather Harlan supervised. He sat on a makeshift bench near what would become the front porch, his bad legs stretched out in front of him, a cup of coffee in one hand, and an opinion about everything in the other. Not like that. You'll split the grain. I know what I'm doing. You clearly don't. Then come over here and show me. Can't. Bad leg. Your leg's been fine for 2 weeks. It's a chronic condition. Flares up when I see someone ruining good lumber. They fell into a rhythm, not the rhythm of the hunt, urgent and sharp and survival-driven. Something slower, quieter. The rhythm of mornings and coffee and work that didn't need to be done by nightfall. The rhythm of two people building something together because the alternative, being alone, had stopped making sense for both of them. Harlan never said he was staying. He just didn't leave. His things appeared in the small storage tent Cade had set up. His rifle leaned against the workbench. His boots sat by the cooler every morning. And one day, without discussion, Cade started building the second bedroom. The cabin took 4 months to finish. On the last day, Cade stood in the clearing and looked at it. Small, simple, square. A covered porch with 2 chairs, windows that opened and closed properly, a door that hung straight on its hinges and didn't creak. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Harlan came out of the tree line carrying a piece of wood, flat, rectangular, sanded smooth. He had carved it himself, though he would never admit to spending time on something so sentimental. He handed it to Cade without ceremony. Cade looked at it. 2 words carved deep into the grain in clean block letters. Not for sale. Cade ran his thumb across the letters, felt the grooves, the weight of it. He walked to the porch and nailed it beside the front door. Stepped back, looked at it. Crooked, Harlan said from behind him. It's not crooked. It's a little crooked. It's perfect. A long pause. The wind moved through the clearing, carrying the smell of pine and fresh-cut wood and the first warmth of a Missouri evening. Yeah, Harlan said quietly. I suppose it is. Cade stood on the porch of his cabin and looked out at the land that was his. The forest, the hills, the sky going orange at the edges as the sun dropped behind the ridge. All of it, paid for in blood and fear, and the stubborn refusal to walk away from something that mattered. He thought about the foster center, the parking lot, the click of the door, $53 in a backpack that smelled like someone else's life. He thought about the diner, the cracked mug, the soup that cost $2.75, the television in the corner playing an auction that nobody watched. He thought about a hand going up, a voice saying, yeah, I'll take it, the laughter that followed and the silence that came after. He thought about Marlene, the county clerk, who held on to the deed a beat too long and handed him a card with a number that led eventually to a man on a ridge with a rifle and a grief as deep as the Ozark Hills. He thought about Nolan, a boy his age who loved the woods and never came home, whose absence had set everything in motion years before Cade walked into that diner, years before he raised his hand, years before he knew any of this existed. He thought about Harlan, the man who had watched a cabin for 2 years, waiting for something he couldn't name, who found instead of justice or revenge or closure, a kid with $53 and no plan, and who against every instinct, every habit, every wall he had built around himself decided to stay. And he thought about himself, Cade, 18 years old, no family, no history, no safety net, standing on the porch of a house he built with his own hands on land he had fought for beside a man who had become, in the quietest and most unexpected way, something like family. The sign on the wall caught the last light of the day. Not for sale. The letters glowed warm against the new wood. For the first time in his life, Cade was not passing through. He was not temporary. He was not a name on a clipboard or a number in a system or a kid in a room that belonged to someone else. He was home.